Welcome to the last session of the classified GSAW portion. I'm sorry, the classified is this afternoon. Okay, so before we start the session, I'd like to make an announcement. There's a NASA GPM, the Global Precipitation Measurement Mission, had a successful launch about half an hour ago. And this is a collaborative effort between NASA and JAXA, which is the Japanese Aerospace Agency. So this is the working group outbrief session. We had very good participation in 6 different working groups yesterday. So the organizers collected all the discussions, and then they are going to present a summary in this session. So please join me in welcoming the leads to start the outbrief. First is going to be Ryan on model-based system engineering approaches.
All right, we had a great discussion yesterday. We had about 20 folks join our discussion on model-based systems engineering. And we didn't just talk about model-based systems engineering. We wanted to talk about the integration of model-based systems engineering for the ground systems with the different layers, the enterprise architecture above and model-based software engineering below, as well as going laterally, looking at the other segments that are involved, like the flight system and the MBSE that's used on that side, as well as talking about, and we spent a lot of time talking about this aspect, is integrating model-based systems engineering approaches between organizations, for example, between an acquirer and a builder. So we spent a little bit of time talking about the benefits of MBSE. We didn't spend a lot of time on that. There was general agreement that there are benefits to going with a model-based approach for systems engineering. And this is just a list of some of the thoughts that we had. We actually spent most of our time talking about the challenges. I mean, we're engineers. We're trying to solve problems. We're kind of bringing the problems that we found to the group and see if other folks had some innovative ways of solving them. So we spent a lot of time talking about challenges, and in particular about how we might navigate that acquire to builder gap, in taking advantage of MBSE's ability to better specify or more rigorously specify what it is that the acquirer wants and what it is the builder needs to build. So we talked a lot about some of the impediments that need to be worked through in order to successfully realize the advantages that MBSE can bring in that environment. So we talked about, from the acquirer side, building a requirement specification out of a model, or even having the model be the requirement specification. And what are the challenges associated with that? Things like formats, standards, how to specify the content in the contract, or just even getting policy and contracts in place to be able to facilitate that. It's a challenge, it's a paradigm shift for them as well. Being able to shift from a textual requirements environment to specifying the models as the requirements. It's a challenge. We talked a lot about human issues and about psychology and some of the impediments to being able to infuse it across an organization. We talked a bit about the impact of MBSE on systems engineering. It's not a silver bullet. It's not the easy button that allows you to fix any problem you have with bad implementation of systems engineering, but it can help you to improve your processes, improve your efficiency and effectiveness of your SE. We talked about integration across levels, and we spent quite a bit of time talking about tools that people were using. And it turned out that we were using pretty much all of the major tools out there for UML-based SysML system modeling. We took an informal poll, and we basically had really good participation across all of that. Of those tools, but we also learned a little bit about ESA's approach, which is a non-UML based approach, as showing some interesting promise to try to improve the problems that we're seeing with model interchange, which is still quite poor at this stage. But some of the conclusions we had were, we talked a lot about the tools and some of the benefits and disadvantages of certain tools. They've come a long way, but there's still a lot of interoperability challenges. We talked a lot about how to try to integrate the system modeling at the system level with the software engineering modeling and UML and the enterprise modeling, potentially UPDM for government systems. We talked a lot about some of the impediments and challenges involved in bridging that acquirer to builder gap. We talked a little bit about how, how do we get programs to commit to or to take on the challenges associated with being one of the early adopters of model-based systems engineering. And I guess we agreed that we need to have a lot more of these success stories come to the forefront. To get to hear more about some of these successes that people have been having in deploying the MBSE and start implementing them and then building more success stories on top of that. And we also talked in the context of the lunchtime speakers subject on crowdsourcing. Are there potentially opportunities to crowdsource getting some innovation from the community at large on potential ways to better utilize MBSE and infuse it across an organization? We didn't have any specific thoughts on how to implement that, but we figured that might be something worth considering in light of this emerging new paradigm. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. The next one would be the cloud computing for ground system by Ramesh. You can stay. Cloud computing by Ramesh Rangachar of Creative Information Technologies. No.
Hello?
Yeah.
Okay, our session was cloud computing in ground systems. This is the 4th year we did this. So our session goals were to examine the state of the art. There were talks across the industry on the state of what's possible. We had presentations on cloud computing, presentations on big data. Something new we did this year was we had a panel discussion where we wanted to better understand what are the adoption issues. We heard even this morning during the panel that it's not the technology. So we wanted to see what were the adoption issues, and we wanted to identify the major issues and set possible goals for the ground community of interest, COI, to investigate this, so to see for the next year. So here is a list of presentations we had. One on the service level agreement and Cloud Federation, and then we had one on NCOIC, okay, the disaster recovery response, and then we had one on data storage and analysis. This was more on big data, how you use big data technologies. There was one on security and various types of authentication in the cloud, and how do you enable Cloud Federation and so on. And the highlight, I would say, of this working group was the panel discussion. This panel discussion was moderated by Sam Cantrell, and this was a very lively discussion. So I did have a lot of key points about technology and other things, and finally, in the interest of time and slides, I had to take them out, and because that was the easy part. We heard that most of the issues are not really technology related, they are more human aspects related. And so the key points there, what a lot of people discussed, was that it's the political issues, it's the economic issues of the cloud adoption that we need to discuss more. The technological ones are clear. Okay, the more we need to discuss about is the more we need to discuss about it, how are we going to architect policies for adoption of this cloud technology. So, are there technical capabilities that are there? Can you get insights from the technology to enforce some of the policies and also some of the economic incentives? There was a lot of discussion between the issues you would have between the ASPs and the ISPs, and how you can prevent finger pointing between the two and so on. Also, there were discussions on public cloud and private cloud, and at the most, people were saying that it's more of a relative discussion, and more importantly, the issue is how much do you trust each other. We had a lot of discussions about public cloud, private cloud, hybrid cloud and so on. And there were a number of program managers who were talking about the different types of levels of trust and other things. So few people, even after the session finished, sat down and came up with something like this. You would have a commercial public cloud, okay? And then you have what they call a government public cloud, okay? And one level below, an enterprise level private cloud, or even maybe an agency level, and even a program level private cloud. The reason why they wanted to do it this way was, okay, does this help address some of the questions we are asking? Some of the questions that we asked, okay, where's my data? Okay, does this give you a better picture to answer the questions, who has access to it? Okay, we said that most of the issues are cultural, so we know, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? So if it is cultural issue, does this help people buy into the program? If you organize it like this, does this help Mr. Flintstone? Is the question. So I don't know the answer to that, but this is what the ground COI and Sam Cantor would have to look into the next year and come back and answer in our next GSAW working group. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramesh. The next one is the current and future ground systems for CubeSats. If ever you got near that room, you would realize that there are just so many people. I'm curious to see how it went. So here is Catherine Manchurini to talk about that.
Good morning. Okay. Yes, as Callie said, we had for the first year for this working group, we were very happy to see such a large attendance, and so it stimulated a lot of good conversation, and we had a lot of audience participation, so we were really happy to see that. So to get underway here, so the session goals were, we had a few. First was to understand what makes a CubeSat mission different from a ground system perspective, and to identify the key misconceptions around CubeSats. From there, we wanted to focus on answering questions about, what are the CubeSat issues that affect ground systems today, and then conversely, what are the ground system issues that will affect future CubeSat missions. We had a great panel, and we had some great conversations. The first was Dr. Charles Norton from NASA JPL Caltech. He spoke a lot to a lot of the efforts going on within JPL, their technology maturation missions and development, and also a lot of talk of the what's next, the future, constellation concepts, beyond LEO missions, deep space. We had Mr. Brian Colfus from SR International. He continued the conversation that he started during his panel session, speech on communications and RF issues. Major Dave Isley from the NRO spoke to some of the efforts in his interests, including government reference architecture, and kind of speaking to acquisition and ConOps. CubeSats as part of a bigger mission architecture, or being as part of a bigger mission architecture. And then finally we had Dr. Jamie Cutler from the University of Michigan, and he spoke to bridging student education, innovative research, and entrepreneurial vision, and also speaking to future ground system needs. Some of the key points, well, we learned a lot, and like I said, we had a very large and diverse group, so it was really hard to distill down a lot of the information that was discussed. But see, these are, I could say, some of the highlights. There's the need for the community as a whole to come together to address some key issues, and some of these we've listed below. CubeSats to have unique characteristics that can drive ground systems, from the number of CubeSats, from tens to hundreds, bandwidth and power, development schedule, and it's very mission ConOps driven. We have everything from a CubeSat that just goes up and beeps to very complex, sophisticated systems. So from a ground system perspective, how do you start tackling those needs and those mission requirements and user needs? Ground system costs, a lot of information about that and discussion on that. Our CubeSat contact costs any cheaper than traditional satellites. New operation concepts, keeping the ground system relevant from a technology and user needs perspective. And where do standards make sense? And how do we share and leverage ground capabilities within the community? Are we at a tipping point? So finally, conclusions. There's definite interest to continue the conversation. CubeSat missions are rapidly increasing in complexity and capability, and we really need to look at the ground systems and how they're going to support those future missions. And those future missions are happening soon, in the next 5 years. So there's not a lot of time. We also kind of had a long discussion of, back to the idea of the con-ops and acquisitions that, operational needs, there's kind of these different families. You have your government, research university, and commercial. So there's a lot of discussion about that. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. There are certain aspects of ground systems that are ripe for standardization, ground station scheduling and planning, ground station to mock interfaces. And finally, the last conclusion point, cost benefit for different ground system strategy isn't really well understood. Federated support versus build your own. And finally, the commonality across all these different families. Is there any commonality among the three that we can use as kind of a starting point to continue the conversation? So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. The next thing is the cyber impact of hosted payloads. This was led by Mark Beasley and Frank Bells of Aerospace. And here is Mark to provide the outreach.
Good morning. Seems like every time I come up here, it's either before lunch or happy hour. I'm sure everybody's ready to do lunch. So we had a somewhat focused topic. As you look at it, it says the hosted payload, cyber impact of hosted payloads. On the surface, that sounds like two different topics, but really they're two intertwined topics. We had a panel and attendees, about 20 folks showed up for our workshop, and they were very focused, experienced, articulate, and we had a high-quality discussion and I think a good exploration of the issues. Participation grew at the break, which was a good thing. We had no attrition or very little attrition. I think we lost one member at the break. And many participants expressed appreciation at the end of the workshop. One thing I'd like to make a public service announcement at this time is we failed to issue any surveys for the participants to participate in. So anyone that is still here that came to our working group, please stop by the front desk and fill out one of the surveys. Otherwise, you may get one in the mail. Here are our stated session goals. We think we met those goals. U.S. Air Force and SMC in particular are in the early phases of an initiative to make hosted payloads a viable tactic for meeting the strategic objectives of the Department of Defense. At the time of this working group, many widespread interest has been materialized, but many other issues are still being addressed. As you can see in our session goals, we did get the chance to talk about the security challenges associated with hosting payloads, and particularly the business and security risk trade-offs, which we kept hearing as a recurring theme. Here are our panelists and presenters. Lieutenant Colonel Mark Kovich, he's the Chief of the Hosted Payload Office, brought a very open information to our group. Brett Arman, Orbital Science, was the program manager on the CHIRP program, which was one of the recently launched hosted payloads. Lisa Berenberg is from Kirtland Air Force Base, aerospace employee who's been supporting hosted payloads for the Space Development and Test Organization at Kirtland. And we had our obligatory John Nellis, who was a information security, cybersecurity expert who provided quite a bit of information on the security aspects of hosting payloads. We also had Dr. Daniel Fisher from the European Space Agency who provided a very good insight into the hosted payload activities occurring within the ESA. So we had some key takeaways from our workshop, our working group. One was a major need was addressed over and over again, was a requirement to develop sound business cases and contractual agreements among the participants. It was felt that unless you have those type of agreements in place, there will be many different types of issues that have to be addressed prior to launching a hosted payload. We also discovered that the ESA is exploring cost-effective ways to share resources, which was a very enlightening information that we received. And lastly, the U.S. government volume of hosted payloads has yet to achieve critical mass or establish a repeatable process. Lieutenant Colonel Rakovich, responsibility in his role as the chief of the hosted payload office is to try to develop some of those repeatable processes and make sure that the DoD use of hosted payloads can be accomplished with little to no issues. I believe that's all I have. Thank you for listening.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mark. The next thing is another new working group this year. And this is the Resilient Future Setups Planning and Architecture. Roberta Ewart and Joe Betzer organized this working group, and here is Joe Betzer to open.
Thank you very much, Kelly. First of all, I'd like to make an observation. It was really nice to see the two development planning topics were among the best attended workshop in this GSAW, which means that people really do care about the future and making sure that we do all that we can to have indeed a better future. So this workshop focused on future SATOPs, and it is a second in a series that started last year. Also, we were very well attended last year, and in fact, we wanted to both maintain and enhance, the positive momentum for future SATOP working group from last year. So we looked at introducing a couple new ideas. STEM was one of them. Resiliency, you heard, is part of the mission statement of SMC these days. Open standards, development, and enterprise architecting, which again are very future-oriented topics. And then we wanted to look at some enabling SMT science and technologies that would offer innovation and ideas and specific projects that actually are instantiations of innovations. We wanted to identify stakeholders, and I would think that most of them were in the room, most of the families of stakeholders, and then we wanted to status some specific projects. So if we move to the next chart, we had 6 speakers, and I spoke about something that I have a lot of personal passion for, which is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM in short, and how can we cultivate the talent? Again, looking into the future, this is really a national challenge that we do have, and we were actually surprised that there was so much passion for the topic within the group. So there was a lot of participation, and a lot of good thoughts that were mentioned. One of the things that you can see if you look at the people, we had 3 fairly fresh officers, recent graduates. We have Captain Sarah Meshburn, who actually presented the SMC Enterprise Ground Architecture. The SMC is trying to do something similar to what the NRO has done a few years ago. And she discussed that in quite a bit of detail, and it's an exciting project, and it's in very good hands, and that was a very good thing to see. She was followed by Captain George Sondecker, who is the SENSE program manager, and he described both the SENSE mission as well as how the ground system for it's essentially a 3U CubeSat worked out. And it was really interesting to see how simple it is and yet how effective it is. Roberta Ewart, the co-chair, described MONA, which is really something that she has personally been spearheading within SMC. And MONA stands for Modular Open Network Architecture. This is a DoD-wide entity, and the SMC instantiation of it essentially is the next project, which Lieutenant Garrett Ellis presented, and it's called SNAP, or Standard Network Adapter for Payloads. That's it was done on a form factor of a medium-sized satellite, the MSV satellite from Northrop Grumman, if you know that buzz. And it was done by Utah State, the Space Dynamics Laboratory, which did a great job. And then Karen Bissani described the ASR, the Agile Space Radio, which was mentioned a number of times in the conference in the context of radios. So the key points that we had discussions of the interfacing standards development, so we are interested in IP-enabled space architecture. We're interested in pushing STEM and engagement and look how we can get better students to come. And if you saw the slate of presenters of 3 very young people, and it was very good to see that the future is in good hands. Some business cases, how can you close those nice open standards and actually at least break even? Stakeholder engagement. It was mentioned by a number of frustrated people in the room that they developed very nice GUIs for ground systems, but the people who operate the satellites were kind of locked in mentally and culturally to command line interface, and you just couldn't get them to make a change because they were worried that if they do that, they are going to risk their mission. So, and it's a well-known thing that the soft stuff ultimately is the hard stuff. Good technical solutions not always work if you don't have good buy-in from the community, and this was mentioned by a number of other speakers here. And then the cross-pollination of the various stakeholder communities is something very good, and it was good to see that so many people came back and are interested in working together, and we plan to do some follow-on activities within the AIAA in terms of standardization. My last chart is the actions to be taken. So we decided to indeed, through the AIAA, work on MONA and work and develop the standards and the various instantiations for various form factors. In fact, one of the ideas that came up, we would like to have MONA for a CubeSat. That would be a nice thing to do. We thought that it's very important to have both industry and academic inputs. We wanted to continue this engagement in STEM area. Many people, both in industry, FFRDCs, the government, can and should engage more on STEM activities. And then the business cases that we want to continue, and of course, we want to extend the development to include CubeSat. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Joe and Roberta. The next one is the cost estimation for the next generation ground systems. This was organized by Jim Alstead and Professor William of USC. And here is Jim to outbrief.
Thank you. Tuesday morning, I saw presentations by Carl Sunshine of Aerospace about some very interesting trade studies that he's doing. He's doing space system architectural trades. One of the topics he talked about was whether to have functionality in space or in the ground. And it seemed to me that since he's always going to be trading costs, that one of the things he needs is a cost estimation model for the satellite system to tell him, well, when you trade this off, what are the costs in the system? And that cost estimation model is COSATMO. Barry, who's over here, and I are working on developing COSATMO incrementally, developing pieces. And when we are, as we develop pieces, we will make them available to the community in general and to GSAW in particular. What we did at our workshop yesterday was to use GSAW to help us develop the model. And that's what our session was about. So our goal was to move forward on developing the part of COSATMO that addressed ground system cost estimation. So the first half of our session was presenters. And we started with Barry and I talking about the current and future challenges for ground system cost estimation. And then we had 3 different presentations about very different perspectives on this problem. We had Kim Bell from Aerospace talk about ground systems cost estimation. So she's actually working on cost estimating on ground systems. And she gave us her information from the Aerospace Concept Design Center. Then we have Ray Madeke of the Naval Postgraduate School, talk about issues in total ownership cost modeling for DoD systems. And the total ownership cost is an important concept because that's what really affects affordability. Customers are interested in affordability these days, which is life cycle cost, not just procurement cost. And so he spoke to that topic. And we finished with Phyllis Marbach from the industry, from Boeing Defense and Space and Security. And she did an affordability case study of a ground system plan, and so she presented on some actual results. So that was the first half of our system, and we were attended, we had pretty decent attendance. We had 23 people attend. We had to get extra chairs in our room. But also, in our session, we forgot to hand out the survey. So the same PSA applies here. You know, if you attended and would like to fill out a survey, that would be great. Then in the second half, we turned it into a working session using the expertise of the people who attended to actually find out elements of our cost estimation. And so one of the kind of the top level point we made is that there's 5 parts of the model for ground system cost. And I'll get to what those 5 are in just a minute. And for each submodel we had, we addressed the issue, so what are the cost drivers for this model? And identify any cost drivers that seem to be like a size. And identify which cost drivers are expected to be the important ones. And we had a few related issues. And the results of our workshop are in slides that GSAW has, and when that material is posted, you're welcome to reference the entirety of that material. But for today, this is just a summary of what we had. So the first sub-model is the initial development software. We figured that was probably already covered by other cost estimating models. Then the next was initial development of prime mission equipment. That seemed to be, the cost drivers there seemed to be, the important cost drivers there seemed to be amount of new development required, the number of prime mission equipment sites, and required stability and reliability. The third submodel was initial development of other facilities like simple, ordinary stations where operators work and so on. And the cost drivers there seem to be the number of facilities and the location of facilities, especially where they're in the U.S. or in a foreign country. The fourth one was operation and support cost. The cost drivers seem to be the number of years of operation and the number of FTE staff needed for the facility. And finally, we had some kind of top-level drivers that were, we called system-level drivers. You know, one is that the system need to be accredited, and what was the required security level, and in particular, were there any cross-domain. So this was a very successful workshop. We definitely moved forward the development of the COSATMO model, and as I said, we look forward to coming back and presenting results at future GSAWs.
Thank you very much, Jim and Professor May. I would also like to thank the participants of the working groups. As we talked about before, that's what makes it more successful when people come and share their lessons learned and their experience. That's what makes it a successful working group session. So I'd like to thank you all. But let's give a hand of applause to our organizers. Thank you all. The next session would be the workshop summary to be chaired by Sam Cantrell and Judy Kerner of Aerospace. Thank you.
I think we had a really great conference this year. There were a lot of really interesting key points. I'd like to just go over a few of those that Judy and I were able to extract from sitting up front and seeing the entire conference up close and personal in the front row. I'd like to thank Judy for a lot of her observations and a lot of the inputs that we had in working together to put this summary together. I'd also like to thank all the participants out there who took notes to help us. It's it's daunting to have to sit through and listen on every word and pick up everything in the conference. So I'd like to thank all of you that took notes and submitted those. The first key point here, I think, was brought up, thinking fast and thinking slow. GSAW is an opportunity to think slow, to take time to look at things and not have to make the snap decisions, to hopefully make the right decision, and to do things in an organized way. And we're seeing now that we're not making do with less, which was sort of the theme from last year, but having to make do with existing. As the general said, he doesn't want to see the $250 million solution for a new ground system, but he wants to see the $25 million solution to adapt an existing system that's out there. How can we leverage the things that we already have in order to make them work for us instead of keep reinventing the wheel over and over again? And also at the panel discussion today, the key point that we need to spend as much time on the connectors as the capabilities. So if we're going to build these systems that are interchangeable and we can use that way, we have to factor that in from the beginning as to how these pieces are going to fit together. We have to build interoperability in from the very start, which also brings up the problem, whose stovepipe is going to pay for this cross-program solution? That's sort of the eternal question, I think. We have to be prepared to accept risks, to expect failures, and ensure recovery. Don't expect perfection from everything we build. And also in hand with that is to pre-plan for shedding of these requirements for capabilities at all points in the life cycle, because when you have a system, a lot of these things have to get pulled off as budget cuts and whatnot happen, and it's good to have a strategy for which things are we going to jettison, to prioritize. Not every requirement is important as every other requirement. Space is, and also you have to do that all throughout the system. So even into deployment, as the general said, as the system, maybe you have physical limitations that are causing your system to collapse, and you want it to be able to collapse gracefully. Space is not just a normal IT problem. And if you want innovation, you have to give people freedom in order to innovate. Let's see, standards, COTS, and open source. There used to be no way, no thanks. But now, of course, they're saying, of course, you know, it's become a standard part of how space is being done. We had, remember we had faster, better, cheaper, pick two. Well, now we've got cost, capabilities, efficiency, resiliency, security, and you got to pick four. So I think we're looking at a time when there are a lot of new paradigm shifts in industry and technology that are coming together. We're coming to one of those hinge points where the community is having to change something rapidly rather than slowly evolve. We're coming to revolutionary changes in this industry. Cybersecurity was something that is huge. It's a big looming concern. Cyber attacks are no longer focused on big spectacular targets, as someone brought up. People are, you know, attacking small little things just to get some notoriety or whatever. And the idea is, how can you reduce your attack surface? How can you limit that your exposure to these sorts of dangers? You know, someone mentioned that every dollar spent on security is $1 less spent on functionality. So how can we balance that? And also someone also mentioned, is just mere compliance the best way to meet security? The idea that, well, we've got this big laundry list of 1,000 key points we have to do. Is that the best way to do it? To just go through and check those boxes, or should this be something that's engineered in from the beginning? Open source is safe because it's open, right? Well, reviewing source code is not the fun part of using open source. You have to plan for vulnerabilities. We also had a great lunchtime talk about crowdsourcing as one of these future paradigm shifts. And as he mentioned, most of the smartest people work for someone else. How can we leverage this? And the hardest part of the problem is defining the problem. I'm going to bear that in mind. Every challenge can be treated as a contest, is how they do business. Testing, integration, security, all these things. And you have to bear in mind that you always have to find the right kind of nerds. And so what are some of the solutions we have? Automation, get the best summer intern ever if you have an automated system. Mitigates the costs of human operators, which we mentioned, Nestor was saying today, that's the big cost driver is the human factor. Also the errors that humans tend to introduce into these systems. Hosted payloads, they address schedule, cost, resiliency, and disaggregation. CubeSats, everyone should love CubeSats, right? It's a wonderful platform for testing new operational concepts, but you've got to bear in mind, right now, they're really in the educational domain. So as someone mentioned about being able to leverage on other designs and take this stuff, they're educational. So they want to reinvent the wheel. So they want to do this whole thing over and over again. You have to be prepared for that. Clouds and virtualization. New systems versus adapting legacy systems, and as they alluded to in the cloud session, a whole bunch of issues, and it also touches on the political and cultural aspects of taking these stovepipe systems and putting them into a horizontally integrated system where no one really is in control of it, and it's less obvious. There's a lot of cultural issues with that. And finally, we had a solution idea to go back commercial practices. So getting a small number of good people, streamlined requirements, minimal reporting. Gee, I don't know, this sounds a lot like ACT reform to me. I don't know if we're going back to the future or not. Anyway, well, what's next? Come to see how it all turns out. Come to GSAW 2015 and March 2 to the 5th. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Sam and Judy, for putting that together. That's quite a tough task, so thank you for that. So we made it. We're at the end of the general workshop. Glad to see all of you still here and looking bright-eyed and ready for more, right? So to conclude, we'll have a few announcements again real quick. Please remember to turn your surveys. We'd love to hear your feedback on how this workshop went and how we can improve next year. For those attending the classified session, remember the shuttle is I believe it's currently running, so that's, if you want to, you can take the shuttle over to the aerospace campus. The session will begin at 1:30, and I believe security will start badging people at 12:30 in the A8 lobby. Proceedings will be available sometime soon after the conference, so look for those at our website at gsaw.org. And finally, GSAW only comes together through the hard work of a lot of really great and talented and dedicated people, so I just want to take a few minutes to thank people. Hopefully I won't forget someone, but usually these things are perilous and you forget someone. But thank you to the GSAW Program Committee. Thank you especially to our admin committee, including Carmelita Johnson, Chiquita Stockton, Robbie Page. You all put in a lot of hard work and we couldn't do it without you. I'd like to thank our corporate communications team, including Lisa Binder, Trina Kilpatrick, and Melissa Morganson, sorry, I just blanked on her. See, I would get something wrong. Those are the ladies that have been really helpful at the front desk, and they've been great. Also, thanks to Paul back there. Oh, good, you're still there. Back AV, who's been giving us great support. Aerospace Enterprise Information Services for their computer support. The Renaissance Hotel staff have been very helpful in the facilities. And especially, I would just like to thank each of you, because really we couldn't make this happen without the great participation from each of your respective organizations. You know, if you look across who everyone here represents, we have a great diverse community of government, commercial, people from various countries, academia, and that's really what, you all are what makes this workshop a success and what make it great. So thank you for coming, and this is again where I plug for GSAW 2015. I hope you'll be here next year. Please come. Later in this year, we will have a call for papers. We'd love, if you presented this year, we'd love to hear from you again. We'd love new participants, so please, submit your ideas for talks and tutorials, and look forward to seeing all of you next year. Thank you.